So after my Kamala Harris video, where I gave her credit on some statements she made and then decimated her record, we got into a few disagreements in the comments, particularly about the idea that certain public programs, namely I believe it was education, public safety, and public health, should be extended to illegal immigrants, ostensibly. And I think the vast majority of us would agree with the first two premise, that the Supreme Court has already ruled that no state can deny public school to any undocumented immigrant, okay? Undocumented minor, to be clear. And undocumented citizens can still call the police. They can still, when they're being robbed or being assaulted or whatever, they can still call the police. So those things are already extended to them. The thing that we got into a massive disagreement on was healthcare. If we do a universal healthcare system, such as single payer, Bernie's proposal, should that extend health coverage to illegal, undocumented immigrants? And I make the argument that it should. Now, here's the thing. I think there are perfectly legitimate criticisms of this. I think that there are perfectly legitimate compromises that could be made on this. Okay, I'm not saying, Bernie's bill, for example, it has an extensive health program. I mean, we're talking dental, we're talking prescription glasses, we're talking all prescriptions are covered. Ambulance rides, I believe, are covered, which in many countries are not. Mental health is covered. I don't know if they've included, I think they've included elderly care in this. I'm not totally sure about that. And I've often said they should include rehabilitation for drug use. Should probably be covered as well. So that's an extensive plan. And I totally understand when people say, all right, this is pretty expensive. Is it economically feasible to extend it to immigrants? And to what degree is this going to make more immigrants want to come here? Okay. So there are legitimate compromises, but I'm willing to compromise on those things, and I'll tell you how I solved that shortly after. But let me just tell you from an ethics perspective why I think this is totally necessary to some extent, okay, to some extent. And again, we'll get to the compromises. But from an ethics perspective, I see universal health care as a moral obligation for the U.S. government to treat all illnesses that can result in premature or needless death and debilitation and just suffering, needless and unnecessary suffering that can be treated. Okay, so basically, when the government can pay for a procedure that would save a life, would treat an illness, then it has the moral obligation to do so for all human beings within the borders of the United States. There are some things that it's not just citizens, it is a human right that the government recognizes and they uphold. And a lot of right-wingers often use the argument that the Constitution did not intend for these rights to be human rights. They intended to be citizen rights, even though that's literally not the wording. But I personally think that we do have an ethical obligation. When it comes to health and literally saving lives, preventing death, you bet your ass we have an obligation, a moral obligation. Because A, we can afford it, and B, economically, there are 12.5 economic arguments for why that contributes to productivity, okay? When someone spends an extended time in the hospital because they have avoided getting a procedure done because they can't afford it, and now they have to get it done, otherwise they die, and they spend an extended time in the hospital, that's lost productivity, that's lost taxes, that's lost economic production. So there are real substantial economic arguments for doing this. But again, my argument is that this should be extended to humans, not just citizens, but humans, because again, this is a moral, ethical obligation to humans. Now, here's where we get to the question of how expensive is that, and what kind of moral obligation do we have? Like, I think we have the moral obligation to treat them and prevent death, unnecessary suffering, and debilitating illness. Those are the three big ones, right? But how far does that go? If it does become the case and it is proven, and I don't know, to be clear, I don't know about this because there's not many good examples and good studies on this. But if it is the case that this would be prohibitively expensive for whatever reason, how do we mitigate that and still reach this ethical obligation to provide life-saving health care to all humans? My proposal, and I got this idea from a friend, admittedly, and I had heard about it before that, but he really kind of fleshed it out, and I'll give him credit next when I have him on the show, because I do plan to interview him. He's an interesting character, very good friend of mine, and he basically proposes that we have a two-tier system where you have the base essentials of healthcare, okay, that's extended to all humans, and then you have an extended package on top of that for all citizens, because citizens, they do contribute more taxes. Obviously, they pay income taxes, more income taxes. Undocumented citizens can't necessarily always do that. So basically, this first package that would cover all people, you would have things like base healthcare, right? Prescriptions, life-saving medications, and you would stabilize them from any diseases that threaten to kill them. You would treat any illnesses that are life-threatening or debilitating or otherwise. And other things like, for instance, mental health, optometry, glasses, maybe dental, things like that that are usually not life-threatening. Now, dental, there's a difference there. Some dental procedures are necessary to prevent life-threatening conditions. So, maybe there's a gray area there as to how much of dental should we cover. Should we also have a base package for dental as well? But in general, what I'm saying here is that the base package afforded to all humans should cover the essentials of health, the things that will keep you from dying, that will keep you from debilitating illness, that would, lead to less economic productivity and would seriously sever and harm their life. So those are the things that would be covered by the base package, and then citizens would get the extended package, rehabilitation for drug use or for addiction, eyeglasses, dental, mental health, etc. So that's the compromise that I would propose if I was having a conversation with a right-winger who's on the fence about this. Maybe they're in favor of universal health care, but they think it's just not possible to extend it to illegal aliens. I would say, to an extent we should, because we have that ethical obligation. However, I'm willing to, look, if it's too expensive, I'm willing to have that conversation. I'm willing to sit down and make a compromise, because ultimately the most important thing here is that we get universal health care, at least for citizens, We need that. We desperately need that. Tens of thousands of people are dying every single year that we don't do that. And this is borne out by the evidence time and time again. There are white lines under our current system. Okay, and in most cases, they are equivalent. And a white line is not, it's not comparable to 30 to 45,000 people dying every year because they don't have basic coverage. And as we've said before, there's no wait line for something that needs immediate assistance. You go straight to the top of the line if you have a life-threatening condition. Straight to the top of the line in virtually all of these countries. So people who make that point is often very misleading. Another way that you could mitigate this problem, if it is indeed true that covering illegal immigrants would be prohibitively costly, you could have a different copay. So in most universal healthcare countries, they have like a $10 or $20 copay for visiting the ER, visiting the doctor, which is just kind of a basic, something to sweeten the pot and help pay for it. Not all countries do this. Some of them you just go and you get covered and that's that. But if we have a $10 copay for citizens, it could be maybe $30, $40 copay for non-citizens. That's reasonable. That's not a lot of money. Most people can afford that. So there are compromises that I'm willing to make. But ultimately, I just happen to think from an ethical standard that basic life-threatening conditions should absolutely be covered because we have that moral obligation. But beyond that, I do think there's a very solid economic argument as well. But guys, ultimately, this is a seriously nuanced discussion. It's a valid point that that in the U.S., our lifestyles are largely contributing and playing a role to our very expensive health costs. It is largely because the private health insurance companies are holding us hostage, yes, but Americans do live very unhealthy lifestyles. There's still quite a few people who smoke cigarettes. There's still quite a few people, the vast majority of us, who just have a terrible diet, absolutely terrible diet, horrendous diet. And I'm willing to have a conversation about what do we do about that. And the thing that I often turn to is food subsidies. In this country, we subsidize foods that are just not that healthy, okay? There are repeated studies, both international and U.S. studies, that show how continuous meat consumption, especially processed meats, we're talking about sausage, we're talking about hamburgers, they are very detrimental to your health. They increase your risk of heart attack. They increase your risk of just general heart disease, cancer, etc. And they contribute largely to our health crisis. I mean, public health crisis. People eat a very poor diet in this country. They don't get enough fiber. They don't get enough vegetables. They don't get enough fruit. And the truth is, we subsidize a lot of these very awful. Dairy is one of those things that, guys, many people seem to think dairy is healthy for human consumption. It's really not. It's really not. It's look into this. Google this. There are numerous examples of why dairy is actually very detrimental to your health. I would rather those tax dollars, I'm not saying don't subsidize food. I'm saying take those food subsidies and put them towards healthy foods. Let's subsidize spinach. Let's subsidize beans. You know, beans are extremely healthy. I would rather incentivize purchasing of those foods. For instance, you could talk about maybe limiting food stamps to only produce and healthy foods rather than, you know, anything goes. And it's not currently anything goes, but it's quite possible to use food stamps to buy unhealthy food as it exists. Another thing is public transportation infrastructure. With how many cars are on the road, especially combustion engines, it is contributing to very poor air quality. People need to get out and walk more. And if you're taking a train, that means that in between, you know, going to the train station, or once you get to the train station, going to where you're going to visit after that, whether it's the supermarket or, you know, visiting a friend or, you know, going to work or whatever, you're going to have to walk that distance, which is probably longer than walking from a parking lot to the door. So I think we should incentivize and invest in public transport. We should incentivize and invest in walkable cities, bikeable cities. This would also contribute to public health. So there's a conversation about individual aspects of this, like how people are living their lives. And I think there are ways the government can incentivize more healthy behavior in ways that, you know, people will largely see as positive. You know, this also, keep it real, it also benefits people. It is, in countries where they've subsidized public transport, it is cheaper to take a train to work than it is oftentimes to drive to work. And gas prices are only going to go up after a certain point. And obviously the extreme cost long term of dealing with this, the climate change aspect of driving these cars is enormous. So we're going to be paying that back eventually anyway. So to me, the balance sheet is pretty clear. Public transport is a lot better. So let's open these conversations. Let's have a conversation about what can we do to incentivize individuals to act more in ways that propagate good health. And probably the most important thing, though, is let's fix this healthcare system and let's get people the treatment that they need. So those are my arguments. And feel free, if you disagree with me at any point, feel free to leave a comment below. Where am I getting this wrong? You know, what is your solution? What is your compromise? Because I think most of us, not all of us, but most of us agree that universal health care is the way to go. But how do we cover those people who are here in the country illegally in a way that prevents needless death while still balancing the budget? And again, and here's one thing that I forgot to mention that is kind of important, and I probably should have mentioned a lot earlier. The most important aspect of addressing illegal immigration and how they use resources while they're here, and again, it's mostly positive. They have a mostly positive impact on our economic sphere. But the best way to mitigate this is border control. You know, and I'm not at this point, and I'm willing to change my mind on this. I'm not totally against borders. I'm not for open borders. I think right now, to an extent, it is totally necessary to have border control. And my stance is that once they're here, leave them the fuck alone. But until they get here, you have every right as a nation to protect your borders and to have somewhat of a border control. And right now, the immigration issue is not a big one in the U.S., okay? In other countries, it may be, but in the U.S., it's not a big issue. We have the last numbers I saw, and this may be changing because there's a lot of refugees at this point, but the last numbers I saw, the net immigration from Mexico was net negative. So more people are going back to Mexico than to the U.S. from Mexico every year. So that's not really a problem in my eyes. That's not necessarily a problem. It's fairly contained at this point. It's fairly contained. There are far more people coming here through legal immigration than illegal immigration every year. And you can look that up. You can look that up. So as far as I'm concerned, illegal immigration is fairly stagnant at this point. It's fairly contained. And I don't think that's too much of an economic burden. But again, I'll have these conversations. I think it's a serious question to ask. These are very nuanced conversations, guys. If you want to think that there's not nuance here, that there's not a serious discussion to be had, beyond the base assumption that we do need universal health care. Obviously, I'm pretty much on that board, ride or die at this point. But beyond that, there's a serious conversation to be had. So don't just laugh at people and call them stupid because they think illegals shouldn't get health care. they think that it threatens their access to healthcare. They're scared. Okay, they think that if we cover illegals, it's going to lead to issues in our health services, and it's going to mean people get less coverage and less access. So they're trying to cover their own backs, right? And they're trying to cover their own families. I do understand why people would have this discussion. I'm not calling you immoral. I'm not calling you stupid. I won't do that. All right. So yeah, let's have this conversation in the comments. Please let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you.